Hello and welcome. The story you're about to hear is about power, a forbidden love affair, and a shocking lie that lasted for nearly 100 years. But it's not the lie one woman was accused of telling. It's the lie an entire nation agreed to believe for nearly a century. Her name was Nan Britton. In 1927, she published The President's Daughter, claiming she was the mistress of the late President Warren G. Harding and that he had fathered her child. Immediately, she was called a whore, the book was banned, and her life was destroyed. She died in poverty in 1991, and it wasn't until 2015 that DNA testing proved she was telling the absolute truth. But the real story here is Nan Britton's courage. She wasn't just a secret mistress. She was a mother fighting back at a time when women were easily dismissed. She did the unthinkable. She self-published her book when no one else would dare print it. She used her own story as a weapon, not just to survive, but more importantly, to fight for her daughter's identity and recognition. She was decades ahead of her time, fighting a lonely battle for the truth. Today's story is about that resilient woman. The real story doesn't begin in the halls of power in Washington, D.C. It begins in another world entirely, the town of Marion, Ohio, right at the dawn of the 20th century. Marion was a small, bustling, quintessentially American town. It was a place of front porches, church socials, and burgeoning industry. It was the kind of town where everyone not only knew your name, they knew your business. And in Marion, there was one man who was the town. His name was Warren Gamaliel Harding. By every account, Harding was impossibly handsome. He was tall, silver-haired, with a deep, resonant voice that made people trust him. He was the publisher of the local newspaper, the Marion Star, a failing paper he and his ambitious wife Florence had bought and turned into a local powerhouse. But he was more than a publisher. He was a joiner, a handshaker, a man who remembered every name. His undeviating republicanism and that vibrant voice led him far, first to the Ohio State Senate, then to the office of lieutenant governor. He was the man who gave the nominating address for President Taft in 1912. He embodied a kind of comfortable, confident American masculinity. And into this small-town world in 1896, Nan Britton was born. She wasn't from the outside. She was one of them. Her father, Dr. Samuel Britton, was a respected local physician. In fact, Dr. Britton was Warren Harding's personal doctor. The families were acquainted. Nan, like many girls in Marion, grew up seeing Warren Harding as a local god. He was the biggest fish in their small pond. Nan was a bright, romantic, and deeply impressionable girl. She later wrote that her infatuation began when she was just a teenager in high school. She would cut out his picture from the Marion Star and pin it to her bedroom wall. He was to her the ideal American man. When he ran for the U.S. Senate, she volunteered for his campaign, handing out leaflets. She wasn't a flapper, not a rebellious figure. She was a good girl from a good family who had a crush on the town's most famous citizen. However, her family was cracking under the surface. Dr. Britton suffered from health problems, possibly alcoholism or a nervous condition that left the family financially strained. Nan's idealized vision of Harding was perhaps an escape. He represented success, stability, and a larger world beyond Marion's city limits. This context is everything. This wasn't a collision of two strangers. It was a story born from familiarity, from small-town proximity, and from the intense, almost feudal power a man like Harding held in a place like Marion. When Harding won his Senate seat in 1914, he left for Washington. He had outgrown Marion, and Nan Britton's schoolgirl crush might have faded, as those things do. It could have become just another story she told about that time I had a crush on a man who became a senator. But it didn't. After she graduated from high school, she too left Marion, striking out on her own. She was ambitious. She wanted to be a modern woman, a secretary in a big city. She landed in New York. But she was young, and for the first time, she was truly alone. She struggled to find work that paid a living wage. And in 1917, adrift in the big city and feeling the pinch of poverty, she decided to write a letter to her old hometown hero, the man whose picture used to be on her wall. She wrote to Senator Warren G. Harding, asking for his help, not for a handout, but for his influence in finding a better job. Harding, a man who was famously and fatefully unable to say no to anyone, especially a pretty young woman from his beloved hometown, wrote back. He invited her to meet him. That meeting in the spring of 1917 would set the course for the rest of her life. It would be her salvation, and it would be her ruin. The invitation was a lifeline, a spark in the cold, anonymous expanse of New York City. For Nan Britton, 20 years old and struggling, the letter bearing the seal of the United States Senate was more than just a reply. It was a summons from the God of her childhood. Warren G. Harding, the man whose picture she had pinned to her bedroom wall, the man whose voice had been the soundtrack of Marion's public life, had not forgotten her. She met him. The exact details of that first meeting in 1917, lost to all but her own later account, were a potent cocktail of nostalgia and power. He was 51 years old, a powerful, handsome U.S. senator at the peak of his charm. She was 20, a secretary from his hometown, brimming with the same infatuation she had felt as a schoolgirl. The power imbalance was not just a factor, it was the entire foundation of their meeting. She was starstruck. He was, as always, charming. Harding's charm was his great political gift and his profound personal failing. He was a man, his friends would later say, who was constitutionally, almost pathologically, unable to say no. This affability had served him well, though his Senate record was largely unexceptional. He was a man who, as one admirer said, looked like a president, and for the party bosses, that was enough. And he could not or would not say no to a pretty, adoring young woman from his past. According to Nan's account, the relationship turned intimate almost immediately. There was no gentle courtship, no wooing. There was an assumption. He was the powerful man. She was the young admirer. He held the key to the job she needed, to the life she wanted, and he made the terms clear. She, in her own words, surrendered to the man she had idealized for a decade. Their love nest, as Nan would later describe it, was not a romantic apartment. It was not a discreet hotel. It was a place of frantic, desperate convenience, a place they were least likely to be seen by anyone who mattered. Often, it was the Senate office building itself. This detail, more than any other, would later be used to destroy her. In her 1927 book, Nan described in detail that was shocking for the 1920s, the mechanics of their affair. She didn't just allude to intimacy, she gave it a time and a place. She described being led, after hours, through the dark marble halls of the nation's legislature, a place of supposed dignity and law, to his private office. And then she described the closet. I was led to a small closet in the anteroom, she wrote. It was here, in this narrow little closet, that the chief incident of this story had its beginning. In that one sentence, Nan Britton had given her enemies their greatest weapon. To the puritanical sensibilities of 1920s America, this was not just a confession of adultery. It was a description of an act so base, so degrading, that it was in itself proof of her depravity. The public, the politicians, the press, they simply could not or would not imagine a U.S. senator, a man of Harding's stature, engaging in a sordid tryst in an office closet. It was too cheap. It was too vulgar. It was, they concluded, the wild fantasy of a perverted and degenerate mind. It was far easier to believe she was a pathological liar than to believe he was a man of such reckless, clumsy appetites. The very detail that gave her story its ring of truth was the one that made it, in the public's mind, an absolute lie. The affair, as Nan described it, continued for the next several years. It was a life lived in the margins, a relationship built on coded messages and stolen afternoons. She was his secret, one he juggled with the increasing burdens of his political ambition. But Nan Britton was not his only secret. She was not even his most dangerous one. To truly understand Warren G. Harding and the establishment that would later protect his ghost, one must understand the story of Carrie Phillips. Carrie Phillips was not a naive, star-struck girl. She was a sophisticated, intelligent, and worldly woman. She was also the wife of one of Warren G. Harding's best friends back in Marion, Ohio, a man named James Phillips. Harding's affair with Carrie Phillips began long before Nan Britton was in the picture, around 1905. It was not a sordid fumble in a closet. It was a deep, passionate, and long-running affair that lasted for 15 years. They wrote each other hundreds of letters, passionate, explicit, and deeply emotional love letters. Harding, with a recklessness that would define his life, poured his heart out onto paper, creating a cache of evidence that would one day hold the power to destroy him. This affair wasn't just a personal betrayal of his wife, Florence, and his best friend. It became a national security risk. During the World War I, Carrie Phillips became an ardent and outspoken German sympathizer. She lectured Harding, by then a U.S. Senator, against the war. She praised the German people and culture, and Harding, in his love letters back to her, not only sympathized but also included statements that could be construed as treasonous or at least deeply disloyal for a sitting U.S. Senator in wartime. Fast forward to 1920. The Republican National Convention is deadlocked in a smoke-filled room in Chicago. The party bosses, tired of the front-runners, are looking for a dark horse. They need someone handsome, someone pliable, someone who looks like a president. They settle on the amiable silver-haired senator from Ohio, Warren G. Harding. Harding is on the verge of winning the Republican nomination for President of the United States. And at that exact moment, Carrie Phillips strikes. She threatens to expose him. She doesn't just threaten to reveal their affair. She threatens to publish his letters. The letters that prove their 15-year relationship. The letters that contain his potentially treasonous pro-German sentiments written during the height of the war. This is not a personal problem. This is a political catastrophe. The Republican National Committee, terrified, swings into action. They send an agent to Marion. They meet with Carrie Phillips. This is not a negotiation. It is a silencing. The RNC pays Carrie Phillips $25,000, a king's ransom in 1920, the equivalent of nearly $500,000 today. But the money isn't enough. They need her gone. As part of the deal, they fund an all-expenses-paid, luxurious fact-finding trip to Japan and the Orient for her and her husband, the very man Harding had betrayed. The deal is simple. She stays out of the country and away from the press until after the election is safely won. This is a rarely discussed but vital fact. The Harding campaign and the Republican establishment knew he was reckless. They knew he was vulnerable, and they had a proven, well-funded strategy for dealing with inconvenient women: pay them off and get them out of the country. Their later shock and moral outrage at Nan Britton's claims were a lie. They were not outraged that Harding might have had an affair. They were terrified that another one had surfaced, and this one, it seemed, couldn't be bought off so easily. Nan Britton, however, was different. She wasn't a sophisticated worldly woman like Carrie Phillips. She wasn't a blackmailer. She was young, idealistic, and in her own eyes, in love. And by 1919, while Harding was juggling his Senate duties, his presidential ambitions, and his other long-term mistress, Nan Britton, was pregnant. This was a complication Carrie Phillips had never presented. This was not a problem that could be solved with a trip to Japan. This was a secret that was about to become a person. According to her story, she told Harding, he was, unsurprisingly, panicked. But this was before he was the nominee, before he was president. He was still just a senator. A plan was hatched, the kind of plan men in power have hatched for centuries. Nan would quietly disappear. Harding, she said, gave her money. He sent her out of the city, away from his life, away from anyone who might know her. She traveled first to Atlantic City and then to a small private home in Asbury Park, New Jersey. On October 22nd, 1919, in secrecy and in shame, she gave birth to a daughter. She named her Elizabeth Ann. Nan claimed Harding saw the child, that he was proud of her, that he called her the most beautiful baby he had ever seen. He promised to support them, but he couldn't acknowledge her, not now. He was on the brink of greatness. In 1920, Warren G. Harding was elected the 29th President of the United States on a tidal wave of popular support. His campaign promise was a return to normalcy. The country, weary from a brutal world war, the Spanish flu pandemic, and the chaotic social upheaval of the Progressive Era, wanted a president who looked the part. They wanted a calm, dignified, fatherly figure. They wanted Warren G. Harding. And as he placed his hand on the Bible, Nan Britton, the girl from Marion, was now the secret mother of the president's secret child. Warren G. Harding's victory in 1920 was not just a win, it was a mandate. With over 60% of the popular vote, he had crushed his Democratic opponent. The American people, shattered by the industrial slaughter of World War I, the terror of the Spanish flu pandemic, and the divisive academic idealism of Woodrow Wilson, were exhausted. They didn't want a reformer or a crusader. They wanted a rest. Harding's campaign promise of a return to normalcy was a stroke of political genius. It was a soothing, nostalgic balm. He was the handsome, silver-haired, fatherly figure who looked, as one party boss famously said, like a president. He was the physical embodiment of calm, dignity, and old-fashioned American values. The nation, in its desperate desire for this image to be true, projected all its hopes onto him. He was the symbol of a new, peaceful, and prosperous decade. And in a small, nondescript apartment, a 24-year-old woman named Nan Britton was now the secret mother of the president's secret child. Her new reality was a paradox of staggering proportions. The man she claimed was her lover and the father of her baby, Elizabeth Ann, was now the most powerful and, in that moment, most beloved man on earth. His face was in every newspaper. His voice was on the radio. He was the property of the American people. And Nan was his most dangerous secret. In her book, Nan's story became even more audacious, almost unbelievable. She claimed the affair didn't stop. In fact, she claimed it escalated, moving from the back rooms of the Senate to the very heart of American power, the White House itself. This, for her later accusers, was the final proof of her fantasy. The White House was not just a home, it was a fortress, a symbol. It was surrounded by guards, aides, and, for the first time in a modern, organized fashion, a dedicated Secret Service detail. The idea that a president could smuggle his mistress into the executive offices for clandestine trysts was, to the public, an offense to the imagination. But Nan provided details. She described how it was arranged not by Harding himself, but by his loyal intermediaries. She claimed trusted Secret Service agents, men whose job it was to protect the president's life, were instead assigned to protect his secrets. She described being smuggled into the West Wing, not through the front door but through side entrances, hurried down corridors when the coast was clear, and then she described the moment that would forever define her scandal. It was a story so specific and so vulgar in the eyes of her critics that it became infamous. She claimed they made love in a small closet just off the executive offices. She described the terror and the thrill of the encounter, the fear of being discovered at any moment by an aide, a politician, or worst of all, by the First Lady, Florence Harding. This closet story, like the one in the Senate, became a national punchline. It was the ultimate symbol of her supposed depravity. But to Nan, it was the desperate, demeaning reality of her situation. She was not a respected partner. She was a secret to be stashed in a closet, a risk to be managed. To understand the sheer, catastrophic recklessness of this, one has to understand the other great power in the White House. She was not a secret. She was a constant, simmering presence. She was Florence Harding. Known to the nation as the Duchess, Florence Harding was a formidable, intelligent, and deeply suspicious woman. She was 5 years older than Warren, and she was, in every sense, the ruthless brain behind his political operation. It was Florence who had taken over the business side of the Marion Star and made it profitable. It was Florence who had pushed his political career, urging him to run for Senate. She advised him on speeches, on cabinet appointments, and as the first future First Lady to cast a vote, she was a keen political operator in her right. Florence knew her husband, she knew his charm, and she knew his profound bottomless weakness. She was keenly aware of the Carrie Phillips affair. Some historians suggest she was the one who pushed for the RNC to pay the blackmail to solve the problem. She lived in a state of constant simmering vigilance, a sentry guarding not just her husband, but the entire political edifice she had helped build. Nan Britton's alleged trysts in the White House were a game of Russian roulette, played not just with his reputation but with the terrifying wrath of the Duchess. While Harding was playing the part of the nation's father, Nan Britton was living a desperate, precarious life. She was a single mother in an era with no social safety net, an era when a child born out of wedlock was a bastard and the mother was a fallen woman. Both were branded for life socially and legally. She was entirely dependent on Harding. She claimed he sent her money, but it was never a stable, agreed-upon sum. It was cash, tucked into envelopes, delivered by intermediaries, or sent through discreet channels. It was hush money, doled out in increments to keep her quiet and keep her solvent, but never enough for her to be truly independent, never enough for her to feel secure. She moved frequently, trying to raise her daughter in secret, trying to avoid the questions that would inevitably come. Who was the father? Why wasn't he here? She lived in a state of constant low-grade panic. Her entire existence and that of her daughter was balanced on the whim of one man. This fragile secret and deeply unstable arrangement depended on one thing and one thing only: Warren G. Harding remaining alive in power and willing to pay. By 1923, the pressure on Harding was immense. His promise of normalcy was curdling. His administration, which he had staffed with his old friends from Ohio, a group that became known as the Ohio Gang, was already sinking under the weight of its own corruption. The Teapot Dome scandal, one of the largest political scandals in American history, was just beginning to break. His Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, had been caught taking massive bribes from oil magnates in exchange for leasing them government-owned oil reserves at Teapot Dome, Wyoming. Other members of his administration were being investigated for graft, fraud, and rampant cronyism. Harding, a man who hated confrontation, was not a master criminal. He was a weak man who had been betrayed by the friends he trusted. He was overwhelmed, exhausted, and reportedly terrified of the impeachment that seemed increasingly possible. He was quoted as telling a friend, "I have no trouble with my enemies, but my friends, they're the ones that keep me walking the floor nights." In an attempt to escape the oppressive, scandal-choked air of Washington and to reconnect with the American people who still adored him, Harding embarked on a massive cross-country voyage of understanding. It was a grueling train tour of the West Coast and Alaska. He was physically exhausted. He was mentally shattered. In San Francisco, on the way back from Alaska, the 57-year-old president, the man who had looked like the very picture of health and dignity, collapsed. The initial reports were confusing. Was it food poisoning from the train? Was it pneumonia? Was it a stroke? He was rushed to a room at the Palace Hotel. For several days, the nation held its breath. Then on the evening of August 2nd, 1923, while Florence was reading a newspaper to him, President Warren G. Harding died. The nation was plunged into profound, genuine mourning. His body was transported back across the country by train, a grim echo of Abraham Lincoln's funeral procession. Millions of Americans lined the tracks, weeping, holding flags, and paying their respects to the beloved president who had been struck down in his prime. He was a martyr, his presidency unfinished. But for Nan Britton, the news was not just a source of grief. It was a death knell. Her lifeline was gone. The money stopped. The Secret Service agents disappeared. The intermediaries vanished. She was 27 years old, a single mother of a 3-year-old child, and the one person on earth who could confirm her story, the one person who held her fragile life together, was dead. The death of a president is a public spectacle. The death of a secret provider is a private catastrophe. As Warren G. Harding's funeral train made its slow, mournful journey from San Francisco to Washington, D.C., and then finally home to Marion, Ohio, millions of Americans wept for a lost leader. But in a small rented room, a 27-year-old woman wept for a different reason. Nan Britton's grief was compounded by pure, cold panic. Her entire world, built on a foundation of whispered promises and cash-stuffed envelopes, had just evaporated. The man who was her lover, her daughter's father, and her sole source of financial support was gone, and with him her tenuous link to a life of any security vanished. The years immediately following Harding's death were a desperate, humiliating scramble for Nan. She had no career. She had no marketable skills beyond basic secretarial work. She had a 4-year-old child whose very existence was a social time bomb. She first tried to appeal to the men who had managed Harding's life and now managed his estate. She wrote letters. She tried to make contact with the Ohio gang, the powerful friends who had surrounded the president. She believed, perhaps naively, that they must have known about her, that Harding must have made some provision for his daughter. She was met with a wall of stone. To these men now scrambling to control the narrative of Harding's presidency and protect his legacy from the encroaching Teapot Dome scandal, Nan Britton was not a grieving partner. She was a nuisance. She was a potential embarrassment. She was, in short, a problem to be ignored, and if she persisted, to be crushed. They shut her out completely. This is the part of the story that is often glossed over. The sheer grinding vulnerability of a woman in her position in the 1920s. The term illegitimate child was not just a legal term, it was a social branding, a scarlet letter for both mother and child. It meant social ostracization. It meant a life of whispers, shame, and closed doors. Nan was trapped. She took odd jobs. She moved frequently from Ohio to New York, trying to stay ahead of poverty, trying to give her daughter, Elizabeth Ann, a life that was not defined by the secret of her birth. But the secret was a heavy, suffocating thing. Nan felt her daughter was being cheated cheated of a father, of an inheritance, and, most fundamentally, of an identity. Nan was drowning in obscurity. She had been erased. And so, with all respectable doors slammed in her face, she decided to do the one thing she had left, the one thing that was entirely her own. She decided to tell her story. She found a publisher, or rather she created one. No reputable publishing house in New York or Boston would touch her manuscript. It was a career-ending, scandalous, and potentially libelous text. So she helped form a publishing front, the aptly named Elizabeth Ann Guild, Incorporated. It was a way to self-publish, to bypass the establishment gatekeepers who had already locked her out. In 1927, 4 years after Harding's death, The President's Daughter was released. America exploded. The book was a sensation, but not in the way Nan had hoped. It was not met with sympathy or understanding. It was met with a firestorm of national hatred and fascinated disgust. The book was, by the standards of the day, explicit. It was not a coy Victorian allusion to an affair. Nan described its mechanics. She wrote about their pet names for each other. She described the trysts in the Senate office, and most infamously, she described the closet in the White House. This was her fatal error and her only path to a truth. By including these specific vulgar details, she made her story undeniable to those who knew Harding's character, but simultaneously made it unbelievable to the public. The establishment's reaction was swift and brutal. This was not a debate. It was a coordinated character assassination. The press, which had mourned Harding as a fallen hero, led the charge. Reputable newspapers refused to even run advertisements for the book. Instead, they ran vicious editorials condemning her. She was the blonde harlot, a degenerate, a common strumpet. They didn't just question her story, they attacked her sanity, her morality, and her very character. This journalistic assault was echoed by the political establishment. Harding's allies, many of whom were still in power, publicly denounced her. Albert Fall, Harding's own Secretary of the Interior, the very man at the center of the Teapot Dome scandal, called her a liar from the sanctimony of his office, long before he was sent to prison. The attack wasn't just rhetorical, it was structural. The book was officially banned in Boston. In a powerful act of government censorship, the U.S. Post Office declared it obscene and refused to carry it, making it illegal to mail the book and throttling its distribution. This official condemnation filtered down to the public, where ministers across the country delivered sermons on her depravity, calling her a perverted woman and unfit to be in the society of decent people. She was portrayed as a blackmailer, a fantasist, or a political tool used by Harding's enemies to smear his good name. The book was driven underground, sold on street corners and back alleys, a piece of political contraband. It became one of the best-selling banned books of its time, but the money brought Nan no peace. She had hoped for vindication. She received a national shaming. The Harding estate, led by the powerful men of the Harding Memorial Association, an organization created to cement his legacy, went on the attack. They didn't just deny the story, they hired private detectives to dig up dirt on Nan. They circulated counter-rumors. One of the most persistent and damaging of these rumors was that Nan was covering for someone else. They pointed to a friend or relative who had also had a child out of wedlock. The rumor was that Nan, a spinster, had simply taken this child to raise as her own and had invented the spectacular Harding story for money and fame. This narrative was far more comforting to the public. Nan wasn't the president's victim. She was a greedy, manipulative liar. For decades, historians, for the most part, sided with the establishment. They were, after all, writing the official record. They dismissed her book as pornographic, unsubstantiated, and unreliable. It was so much easier to believe that. It was easier than believing that the handsome, dignified 29th President of the United States was a weak, reckless, and deeply duplicitous man who would have sex with his mistress in a White House closet and then abandon their child. Nan, however, tried to fight back in the only arena left to her, the courts. In 1931, she sued a man named Charles Augustus Clearfield. Clearfield, with financial backing from the anti-Nan syndicate, had published a book called The Answer to the President's Daughter, which was a brutal page-by-page debunking that called Nan a deliberate liar and a fraud. Nan sued him for libel. The trial was a circus. It was, in effect, her one and only day in court, her one chance to prove her story. It was a disaster. The defense's strategy was not to prove Clearfield's innocence, but to prove Nan's bad character. Their lawyers dragged her private life through the mud. They brought in witness after witness to testify to her moral failings. But the most powerful evidence against her was the lack of evidence for her. Where were the love letters? This was her fatal weakness. Harding, unlike his affair with Carrie Phillips, had been careful. Or, as Nan claimed, the letters had been destroyed by him or seized by his family and the Secret Service immediately after his death. Carrie Phillips, the sophisticated blackmailer, had kept her letters and they were her leverage. Nan Britton, the romantic, had only her story. Without the letters, it was just her word against the ghost of a sainted president. She lost the case. The jury sided against her. It was the final official legal stamp on her story. Nan Britton was a liar. The trial broke her. She was now not only a social pariah, but a legally discredited one. She had no recourse. She had no allies. She had no future. She and her daughter, Elizabeth Ann, did the only thing they could. They disappeared. The jury's verdict in 1931 was more than a legal defeat. It was the final shovelful of dirt on the burial of her reputation. The press, the politicians, and now the courts had all officially ratified the same truth. Nan Britton was a liar. The trial broke her. It had been her last desperate attempt to use the systems of power, the press, and the law to get a fair hearing. Instead, those systems had been turned against her, used as a public stage to reenact her humiliation and solidify her status as an outcast. She was now 35 years old. She was a legally discredited pariah. She was a single mother to a 12-year-old girl who was old enough to read the newspapers, old enough to hear the whispers, old enough to understand the names her mother was being called. This is the part of the story that is almost never told. The scandal is famous. The quiet, desperate, 6-decade-long aftermath is not. Nan Britton and her daughter, Elizabeth Ann, did the only thing they could do. They vanished. They retreated completely from public life, becoming ghosts in their own country. Nan Britton, the name that had been sensationalized and spat out by a nation, ceased to exist. She took on a new name, Mrs. Elizabeth N. Christian. It was a simple, respectable, and most importantly, anonymous name. It was the name of a widow, a Mrs., which offered a thin veil of protection and respectability in a world that had none for a single mother. She lived under this alias for the rest of her life. She moved around the country from Ohio to New York to Chicago, and finally, decades later, settling in Oregon. She was not running to anywhere. She was running from her own identity. She worked a series of menial jobs, scraping by as a secretary, a clerk. The woman who had been the lover of a president who had walked the halls of the White House now lived a life of quiet, persistent poverty. The life of her daughter, Elizabeth Ann, was even more complicated. For her own protection, Elizabeth Ann was not raised by Nan in her early years. She was given to Nan's sister Elizabeth and her husband Scott Willits in Athens, Ohio, and was raised for a time as their child. It was only after the book was published that Nan, in a fraught reunion, reclaimed her daughter. Elizabeth Ann lived a life of shifting identities. On her birth certificate, a doctor had mistakenly written Emma Eloise Britton. As a child, she sometimes used the surname Harding, or the alias Christian, which her mother had adopted. She eventually graduated from Sullivan High School, and in 1D38 married a man named Henry Edward Blazing. She and Henry settled, living a quiet, normal suburban life, first in Chicago and later in Glendale, California, where they raised 3 sons. By all accounts, she was a lovely, well-adjusted woman, but she carried that secret and the burden of her mother's notoriety with her every day. Nan, meanwhile, grew old in her poverty and her alias. She never recanted her story, not once. To her daughter, to her grandchildren, she was unshakable. This was the truth. But she stopped telling it to the world. The world had told her, in no uncertain terms, that it would not listen. Decades passed. The Roaring Twenties gave way to the Great Depression, then to World War II, then to the Cold War. Presidents came and went. America changed completely. In 1964, a new piece of the Harding puzzle emerged, but it only seemed to cement Nan's status as a fraud. The love letters between Warren G. Harding and his other mistress, Carrie Phillips, were discovered. They had been sealed by court order and locked away for decades. Historians were finally allowed to see them, and they were real. They were passionate. They were explicit. They confirmed beyond any doubt that Harding had a 15-year-long, deeply intense affair right under the nose of his wife and his best friend. This discovery, ironically, was used as the final nail in Nan Britton's coffin. The argument from the remaining Harding loyalists and many historians went like this. See, Harding did write passionate, foolish letters to his mistress, and those survived. Carrie Phillips had proof. If Nan Britton's story were true, where are her letters? Where is her proof? No one seemed to seriously consider the obvious alternative conclusion, that Warren G. Harding was a man so reckless, so driven by his appetites, that he was capable of maintaining multiple long-term affairs simultaneously, treating each woman differently based on her power and his leverage over her. Carrie Phillips was a sophisticated, wealthy, and married woman who had blackmailed the RNC. She was a woman who would have known to keep the letters. Nan Britton was a young, naive, working-class girl who was in love, or at least in awe. She was a woman who might have believed him when he said to destroy the letters, or who, as she claimed, simply had them taken from her. The discovery of the Phillips letters reinforced the official narrative. Harding was a cad, yes, but he was a cad in that specific, well-documented way. Nan Britton remained what she had always been to the historians, an unsubstantiated pornographic footnote, a liar. Nan Britton grew old. The world moved on. The Harding scandals faded, becoming a historical shorthand for corruption. Teapot Dome. Harding himself was largely remembered as a failed, corrupt, but ultimately charming and handsome president. Nan became a historical curiosity, a punchline in a trivia question. In 1991, in a nursing home in Oregon, Mrs. Elizabeth Ann Christian died. She was 94 years old. She died as she had lived for 64 years in obscurity and poverty and, in the eyes of history, as a liar. It seemed for all the world that the Harding machine had won. They had outlived her. They had controlled the narrative, the official story, written by powerful men and respected academics, was set in stone, but they hadn't counted on science, and they hadn't counted on the stubborn belief of a family. The story should have ended there. In 1991, with Nan Britton's death, the case seemed officially closed. The establishment had won. The truth, as written in the official biographies and history books, was that Warren G. Harding was a flawed president, but Nan Britton was a delusional, money-grubbing liar. For decades, this was the accepted narrative, not just in classrooms, but within the Harding family itself. Descendants of Harding's brothers and sisters grew up with this story. They were raised on a fierce defensive loyalty. Nan Britton was the woman who had tried to smear their family name. She was, as one descendant, Peter Harding, would later recall, a money-grubbing liar. This was the family gospel, an article of faith passed down through generations to protect the reputation of their most famous ancestor. But Nan Britton's family had its own gospel. Her daughter, Elizabeth Ann, had lived her entire life with the secret, and she had passed that secret on to her own sons, Nan's grandchildren. They too had grown up with a story, but their story was one of a brave grandmother, a woman who had told the truth, a woman who had been unjustly crushed by the most powerful people in the country. They had seen her quiet dignity. They had felt her unshakable conviction. They believed her. For most of the 20th century, these two opposing family truths existed in parallel, with no way to bridge the gap. It was belief versus belief, story versus story, but they hadn't counted on science. As the 21st century dawned, a new and revolutionary tool became available, a tool that Nan Britton, in her wildest dreams, could have never imagined. It was a tool that didn't care about reputation or power or official history. It was a tool that simply read the truth as it was written in the very cells of the family. DNA testing. The idea began to percolate. James Blazing, one of Nan Britton's grandsons, had grown up with his grandmother's story. He believed her, but he wanted more than belief. He wanted proof. He wanted the world to know. At the same time, Peter Harding, the grandnephew of the president, a man who had been raised on the liar story, was also a historian. He was curious. The family narrative was strong, but what if it was wrong? In 2011, the online genealogy company Ancestry.com saw an opportunity to solve one of the 20th century's most enduring historical mysteries. They approached both families. The proposal was simple. They would use genetic genealogy. They didn't need to exhume the president's body, a request that had been denied for decades. They just needed the DNA of two living men, Peter Harding, the president's grandnephew, and James Blazing, Nan's grandson. If Nan Britton's story was a lie, the two men would be complete strangers, their DNA showing no more connection than any two random people. If, however, Nan Britton had been telling the truth, if Warren G. Harding was indeed the father of Elizabeth Ann, then Peter Harding and James Blazing would be second cousins. They would share a recent common ancestor, President Warren G. Harding. The families agreed. The DNA samples were taken, sent to the lab, and the geneticists began their work. The results came back in 2015, and they were quiet, scientific, and absolutely irrefutable. James Blazing and Peter Harding were second cousins. The test confirmed with more than 99.9% certainty that they shared a common ancestor. The only person that ancestor could be was Warren G. Harding. Nan Britton had been telling the truth, all of it. The schoolgirl crush in Marion, the meeting in New York, the tryst in the Senate office closet, the pregnancy, the baby, the secret visits to the White House, the desperate, humiliating life that followed. It was all true. The revelation landed like a quiet bombshell. There were no screaming headlines, no national trials, just a simple, elegant scientific fact. This fact proved that the official history, the one written by powerful men, protected by political parties, and repeated by respected historians for nearly 90 years, was wrong. and the hysterical, shamed, degenerate single mother, the woman who had been legally branded a liar and forced into a life of poverty and obscurity, had been right all along. The significance of this is hard to overstate. This wasn't just about closing the book on an old presidential affair. It was a profound and deeply tragic vindication. It proved that a 20-year-old girl could be seduced and used by a 51-year-old senator. It proved that a president of the United States could and did carry on a reckless affair in the White House itself. And it proved that the establishment, the press, the political parties, the historians, and the courts had conspired either actively or through willful blindness to systematically silence and destroy the woman who dared to speak that truth. They hadn't just disagreed with her. They had dismantled her character, her sanity, and her life, all to protect the reputation of a dead man and the dignity of his office. Even in the face of this absolute scientific proof, the power of the old narrative remained. Some Harding descendants publicly dismissed the findings, still insisting against the biological evidence that Nan Britton was a liar. The shame they had been taught to associate with her name was for some more powerful than the facts. But for Nan's family, it was everything. James Bleasing, her grandson, said it best. He said he was proud of his grandmother, who had shown a lot of courage to stand up against the most powerful people in the country and the president's own family. The woman America refused to believe was, in the end, the one person telling the truth. Nan Britton's life is ultimately a profound American tragedy. She wasn't a hero. She was a flawed, romantic, and deeply naive young woman who got involved with a powerful man. She was a single mother who, in an act of desperation and perhaps righteous anger, wrote a book to claim her daughter's birthright. And for that, she paid a price that is almost unimaginable. She was slut-shamed by an entire country. She was erased from the history she had been a part of. She was forced to live a life of poverty and aliases, all to protect her child from the very truth she had tried to set free. She died without ever hearing the words, "We believe you." Her story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Who do we listen to? Whose stories do we validate? And whose do we dismiss as hysterical, unreliable, or degenerate? Nan Britton's story was another Me Too story, born 70 years before its time. She spoke truth to power, and power crushed her. History is full of ghosts, full of voices that were silenced. But every now and then, one of those voices finds a way to speak again, long after its owner is gone. Nan Britton's voice, carried across a century by the simple, elegant code of her DNA, finally and definitively won the argument. She was not a liar. She was not a pervert. She was a woman who loved a president, had his child, and refused to be erased. Her name was Nan Britton, and she was the mother of the president's daughter.